Hey everybody. uh, I'm reading like the preface and like the introductory stuff for Svetozar Stojanović's Between Ideals and Reality: A Critique of Socialism and Its Future, translated by Gerson S. Scher. It starts with a quote from Feuerbach. Quote, "Do not seek to be a philosopher without being a man. Be nothing other than a man who thinks. A man who thinks. Do not think as a thinker would, i.e., do not think in a context which is torn out and isolated from real human existence. Think as a living, real being, as one who is exposed to the revitalizing and refreshing waves of the ocean of the world. Think in existence." End quote. Ludwig Feuerbach. Translator's introduction. Ever since the days of the abortive Paris Commune a century ago, the analysis of socialist society has presented serious Marxist thinkers with the dual challenge of rediscovering the bases of Marxian social theory and of applying that theory to new and unfamiliar historical situations. All such theorists, among them the author of the present work, have been confronted by the distinction between Marxism as critical theory and Marxism as ideology. The original aim of Marxian social theory had been a thorough and systematic critique of the basic assumptions of capitalist society, and a more accurate representation of that society than had been achieved by the classical political economy of Karl Marx's day. But under the specific subject matter of Marx's major work, his, quote, critique of political economy was a critical method that refused to accept the self-conception of all forms of class society, a self-conception in which the ruling class falsely imagines that the existing configuration of social and political authority is based on universally and externally valid abstract principles of right. In Marx's own words, quote, "For each new class which puts that class's self in the place of the class ruling before the new class, is compelled merely in order to carry through this new class's aim to represent this new class's interest as the common interest of all the members of society that is expressed in an ideal form. This new class has to give this new class's ideas the form of universality and represent this new class's ideas as the only rational, universally valid ideas." End quote. Marx, The German Ideology. Thus, for Marx, the critique of capitalist society began with the critique of capitalist society's false concepts, capitalist society's ideology. The problem of contemporary Marxists, particularly in the socialist countries, has been precisely to revive this critical element of Marxist thought, and to unfetter this critical element from the shackles imposed upon this critical element by Marxism's paradoxical role as the basis for ruling ideology. In Eastern Europe, the outcome of the confrontation between critical and ideological Marxist analysis has been a body of thought known as, quote, Marxist humanism, end quote, or alternatively, quote, socialist humanism, end quote. Footnote. For a sampling of this literature, see Erich Fromm's edited volume, Socialist Humanism and International Symposium. See also Gayo Petrovich's Marx in the Mid-20th Century, published in 1967, Leszek Kolakowski, Toward a Marxist Humanism, and Adam Schaff's Marxism and the Human Individual. End footnote. I have a lot of pieces from the Socialist Humanism on this channel. The Socialist Humanism International Symposium, edited by Erich Fromm on this channel. End footnote. Upon a clear re-examination of Marx's works, including his early works, which discovered only in the 1920s and 1930s had not previously been considered part of the literature of classical Marxism, it was asserted that Marx's chief concern had been with human existence in society. With man as a producer whose very existence is necessarily bound closely with that of his fellow producers, and with the manner in which this productive activity and this productive activity's forms become, quote, alienated from man and threaten ultimately to destroy man. Alienation emerged as the central category of Marxian analysis, a yardstick whereby the quality of human existence in any given society could be measured. Marx, in this interpretation, had demonstrated that alienation was one of the chief features of capitalist society, in the alienation of the producer from the means of production, from the process of production, and from the end results of that process, characterized by the existence of, quote, commodities, and in that institution which is the embodiment of alienated social activity, the state. Further, Marx had understood the socialist revolution to be that action whereby the proletariat, the totally alienated class under capitalism, definitively transcends all alienation, including the state. But with the socialist revolutions of the 20th century, especially in Russia, China, and Yugoslavia, and the obvious persistence of state power in social society, the question inevitably arose, is there alienation in socialism? As if this were not enough, some Eastern European Marxists have even dared to venture an answer. Yes, there is. Perhaps nowhere has the Marxian critique of contemporary socialist society been more trenchant than in Yugoslavia. But one of the peculiarities of Yugoslav critical Marxism is that it was inaugurated from above, in an attempt to understand and to censor another, quote, socialist society that had served as a model for the Yugoslav communists, whose only fault, it seems, was to have followed that model too closely and conscientiously. The, quote, back to Marx, and, quote, movement the quote back to Marx movement in Yugoslavia is launched by Tito's comrades in arms, Edvard Kardelj, I'm not sure how to pronounce that person's name, and Milovan Djilas. In 1949, by which time the initial shock of the Common Form resolution of a year before denouncing the Yugoslav communists had largely dissipated, the goal of this movement was to rediscover what in the work of Marx, Engels, and Lenin could help to explain why such good practicing Marxists as the Yugoslavs had been excommunicated from the organ of world communism and from the Soviet Union, the, quote, motherland, and, quote, of socialism. They found the answer in an idea that had been aired by Marxist critics of the Soviet Union in the late 1920s and 1930s, the, quote, bureaucratic degeneration of the socialist revolution, end quote. Implicit in this critique, of course, was a self-critique of Yugoslav socialism as well, and in modern Yugoslav historiography, the years 1945 to 50 are known somewhat euphemistically as the, quote, administrative period, end quote. On the basis of their rejection of Soviet practice and the new understanding of Marx, the Yugoslav communists proceeded still from above to sketch the outlines of a truly socialist society in which worker self-management would be the fundamental operative principle. The experiment in worker self-management was formally launched on a large scale by Tito in 1950, and by 1952 to 1953, far-reaching reforms had been instituted in the economic and political spheres of Yugoslav life in conformity with this basic principle. But at the same time, partly as a consequence of this revolution from above, Yugoslav Marxism became the theoretical foundation for a new, albeit different, institutional order. It was thus transformed very slowly from radical theory into a new ideology, a process quite familiar to students of Marxist movements. Yet throughout the 1950s, at the exception of the brief interlude of 1955 to 1956, while the struggle with the Soviet Union remained intense enough to galvanize Yugoslav society into unity, this movement from radical critical theory to ideology, while real, was only barely perceptible. By the early 1960s, however, it was possible to sense stirrings of a movement among certain Yugoslav Marxist philosophers and sociologists to revive critical Marxian theory and to apply critical Marxian theory, quote, not afraid of its own conclusions, nor of conflict with the powers that be, end quote. That's a quote from Marx. Marx letter to Arnold Ruga, September 1843. To the concrete social problems of contemporary Yugoslavia. After several frustrating attempts to establish a journal dealing with such issues, a group of these scholars, some of whom had been quite active in the early critique of the Soviet Union, finally succeeded in 1964 in founding the philosophical journal Praxis. Footnote, published in Zagreb in both Yugoslav and international editions, end footnote. Articles appearing in Praxis treat topics ranging from general problems of Marxian philosophy, anthropology, and social theory, and the relation of these to other current schools of thought, to problems of Yugoslav social practice, including the complex issues of the nature of socialist economy, the role of the state in socialist society, and Marxian theories of revolution, nationality, conflict, and cultural criticism. because of its persistent relevance and direct manner of confronting Marxian theory and social reality, and especially in view of the fact that Praxis has survived intact longer than any other similar East European journal without making a single major concession, is perhaps the most remarkable and provocative publication in Eastern Europe today. Svetozar Stojanović has been a regular contributor to Praxis since Praxis's inception, and many of the ideas behind the present work were originally developed on the pages of that journal. Professor Stojanović completed his doctoral dissertation on, quote, contemporary metaethics, unquote, at Belgrade University in 1962 and has also studied in Great Britain and the United States. Among other distinctions, Stojanović has served as president of the Philosophical Association of Serbia and vice president of the Yugoslav Philosophical Association, and is presently chairman of the Department of Philosophy and Sociology of Belgrade University and a member of the editorial board of Praxis. Stojanović's work, generally representative of the revival of critical Marxian social theory in contemporary Eastern Europe, is especially noteworthy for its directness and its sharp, penetrating manner of proceeding to the root of the problems of socialist thought and practice, to which the present work bears more than adequate testimony. When in 1919 Georg Lukács delivered the inaugural lecture to the newly established Institute for Research in Historical Materialism in the Soviet Republic of Hungary, Lukács emphasized that Marxism had arrived at a crucial turning point in its already long and complex history. On the one hand, he reaffirmed that the, quote, most important function of historical materialism is to deliver a precise judgment of the capitalist social system to unmask capitalist society, end quote, Lukács. Yet Lukács also recognized the new task confronting the Marxian method of analysis, tasks which demanded that the, quote, dialectical method, end quote, of historical materialism be applied, quote, to an area to which, because of its historical character, it could not be applied before, end quote. That is, to socialist society. In Between Ideals and Reality, Professor Stojanović demonstrates that Lukács' concern for a meaningful Marxism in a new historical situation still possesses a great deal of persistence and vitality. I would like to express my deepest thanks to several people who assisted me in no small way in the preparation of this translation. To Professor Stojanović, Susan L. Marrow, Marjorie Levine Scher for their numerous and invaluable editorial suggestions, to Uli Widmeyer for helping me to translate several passages from Marx from the original German, and finally to Professor Robert C. Tucker of Princeton University for his warm encouragement and inspiration. A special note of thanks and appreciation. Of course, any remaining shortcomings in the translation are purely my own responsibility. Translator. GSS. I don't remember the rest of the name. I just know Cher. I don't feel like scrolling back to the top. Introductory note. My previous book, and I think this is Stojanović speaking now, Savremena Metaetika, Contemporary Metaethics, published in Belgrade in 1964, represents a methodological, epistemological introduction to a long-term engagement in true normative ethics, but it has long been recognized that the ethical theorist cannot take a single serious step without going into political philosophy. As a Marxist, I have naturally been interested from the first not so much in moral and political philosophy in abstracto as in the moral and political philosophy of socialism. But the development of socialism is still oppressed by the terrifying nightmare of Stalinism. It is for this reason that a central feature of the Marxist philosophy of socialism is the struggle with Stalinism. This book is primarily an attempt to make a contribution to this critical process. My work on this book has covered a period of a few years, and in the course of it, especially in the last 2 years, I have published several individual pieces in domestic and foreign journals and publications. Nevertheless, this book is not an anthology of published texts, but rather constitutes a whole in itself, a fact which is reflected in its structure. The first part is of a philosophical programmatic character, the second embraces the problematic of the political philosophy of socialism, and the third deals with the moral philosophy of socialism. The work which lies before the reader is predominantly of a philosophical nature. I say, quote, predominantly, because I have not hesitated in the least to enter the province of individual social sciences such as sociology and political science. I have been obliged to do so as a consequence of the themes which I have chosen. Marxism, after all, has never been a theory in which sharp boundaries between individual disciplines have been recognized to exist. Finally, I should mention that in order to be clear and concise, I have tried as much as possible to free the final text of crude material, documentation, references, and the like which have been a help to me in the course of my work. I leave to the judgment of the reader only the condensed essential results. Belgrade, December 1968. Stojanović. Preface to the English edition. 4 years have gone by since I finished writing this book. It's completely natural that I would approach certain problems rather differently where I write in the book today, and the only essential changes I would introduce would be in those pages where I discuss China. As is evident from my article in the New York Review of Books, my treatment of China is now rather more balanced. Nevertheless, I've decided to let the English edition remain exactly the same as the Serbo-Croatian original, which appeared in 1969. Stojanović. And now I'm going to read the table of contents. Part 1, The Approach. Chapter 1, Marxism as a Critique of Socialism. Chapter 2, The Dialectic of Alienation and the Utopia of De-alienation. Part 2, The Epochal Dilemma. Chapter 3, The Status Myth of Socialism. Chapter 4, The Communist Party at the Crossroads. Chapter 5, Socialism and Democracy. Chapter 6, Self-Government in a Socialist Community. Part 4, Heights and Depths of Morality. Chapter 7, The Ethical Potential of Marx's Thought. Chapter 8, The Characterological Course of the Socialist Revolution. Chapter 9, Revolutionary Teleology and Ethics. Chapter 10, Toward a Mature Communism. Okay. So now that I'm done reading the table of contents, that's the end of the video. Well, thanks for listening. This is the book I'm reading right now, so hopefully it's good. Thanks for listening.